I'm Matt Booker.
I am Dave Laird.
I'm Sergio della Pava, and this is the Concavity Show.
Oh, there you go. You got it. You nailed it. Sergio de la Pava, thank you so much for being here today. If
Yeah.
for somehow our listeners are not familiar with you, I will give a brief bio, which is very short on details. But Sergio de la Pava is the author of four novels: Naked Singularity, Lost Empress, Personae, and now, as of November 2024, Every Arc Bends Its Radian, out from Simon and Schuster. Naked Singularity, I should note, won the 2013 Penn Robert Bingham Prize and was made into a feature film. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah,
And
I'd
he's
like to.
coming to us today from New York. So, Sergio, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you both for the invitation.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Welcome to episode 84 to everybody as well. And if you've listened to the show for any amount of time, we've been around for about 10 years here. You've heard the name Sergio De La Pava a lot. You're a kind of a mainstay name on this show, Sergio. So it's wonderful to finally get you on and talk about your body of work, and especially your newest book, Every Arc Bends Its Radiant. So thank you for joining us again. Um, where do we want to start, guys?
So, so
There's
I
so
would
much to
say,
cover.
we're recording this in the days after the death of David Lynch. And
Yeah, this week, true.
one thing, reading a lot of the tributes to David Lynch, this is a man who is reluctant to speak about his films in great detail, and sort of said
Totally.
like
Yeah.
the work speaks for itself. And so it's made me a little self-conscious of like going to a great artist and asking them to speak about their work, because I think in a way it's probably a bit annoying. So I want to apologize in advance for asking. I hope that we can speak around the art in some ways rather than just, here's this thing, let's talk about it. Like, I think
I think
there,
a conversation can itself be an art object, and we can use these uh, elements to jump off and create something new. Doesn't necessarily look. I get where he's coming from. It can sometimes feel like almost like you're involved in salesmanship, like you're selling a fridge and look, it makes ice in these shapes and it does this and it does that. When really what I think he would say is like I said what I wanted to say in a way in a way of using the word said, um, and it wasn't in the plainest way possible intentionally, and then kind of then placing it into stark plain terms dilutes that a bit. I think. Um, I'm an admirer. I was an admirer. That was a little painful news a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
And I think when your name becomes like an adjective, Lynchian, that means that you are pursuing your own course. And if some people are moved by that, I think he would have said great. And if some aren't, I think he was the primary consumer of what he was doing, and
Yeah.
and that's always refreshing.
well, in your book, your books in general, I would say, are de la Pavian, meaning that there's nothing else
Doesn't
like
roll off
them.
the tongue, but okay.
But
I
if
like
you,
it.
maybe we'll come up with a new adjective later. But I also mean it as a compliment in that there are Lynchian elements, especially in this book.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
we can explain maybe a little bit about what I mean by that later. Um, but there is this paradox I just want to acknowledge up front, which is that I enjoy reading interviews or listening to interviews with artists, filmmakers, writers that I admire. But on the other hand, I also see that there's this inherent quality to them that is, that the work should speak for itself and the artist shouldn't have to explicate anything for a great work of art to be meaningful.
Well, I'll tell you. So, I'm going to assume you're familiar with things like the ending of A Naked Singularity. Um, it's like 2008. I've self-published the book. I get this like urgent phone call from my cousin. Okay, I just finished. No bullshit. What happens next? Like I'm your cousin.
Yeah.
Don't fuck with
Cut
me.
the
Right.
I
crap.
get the inside
Yeah,
scoop.
tell me
Yeah.
exactly what happened afterwards. And I think that misunderstands things in
Yeah.
a way. That I have no greater authority Once it's out there and exists, and you're the reader, you come in. It's a collaboration, and I have no greater authority than you do, um, as the reader and slash collaborator. Another person from work came up to me again. It's a long time ago at this point. I said, "I get it. I get it. He actually dies about 100 words in, and the rest is here." And
Sure. Why
that
not?
doesn't annoy me.
Yeah.
That actually, you feel like on some level, okay, mission accomplished.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it to the point that you then can function as an artist and take off in the direction you want, I think is a valuable thing. And I've always felt that my responsibility as the person who's like shooting these things out into the world is to create a platform for that. Um, and when I read works of art or watch movies where it's clear that there is no platform for that, that it is really like what you see is what you get, I tend not to respond to that stuff as much. That's why
yeah.
Lynch definitely saved room for the viewer slash consumer to take off in their own direction.
It's
And
like
that's
the New Yorker cartoon this week that had David Lynch at the gates of heaven and God's standing there with a book, and God says to Lynch, "So who actually did kill Laura Palmer?" Like,
exactly. And
it's,
look, I'll confess,
if God's asking that question, then mission accomplished.
that on some level, I was pissed by the ending of the fairly recent series, right? The
Season three.
Return.
8 or 10
Yeah.
episodes, and then over time, I realized that there's a selfish side of you that does want the pat, clean, easily explicable ending,
Yeah,
but that the more intellectually interesting stuff doesn't give you that necessarily. There's a Yeah, and if you watch, I mean, I've seen clips of him like actually directing his movies, and he obviously he was. It's no secret he believed very much in the power of dreams and creating this dream. It also reminds me of like John Gardner. I hope I'm saying it right. So I don't even have any.
Yeah.
But,
Grundle.
famously really good writer. I'm sorry, teacher of fiction writing, would say that it's your job to create a vivid and continuous dream. I don't think Lynch would definitely wouldn't agree with the continuous part, but he would agree with the vivid and the dream part of that. And if you watch him on set, I think somebody would come up to him and be like, "Well, we really don't have the budget to do that again." Like, God, how can the only time you'd see him really get angry is like, "What does that have to do with anything?" It was just like, "Well, you entered that world where it's like everything." So I think a lot of him is famous examples of his frustration. Another meme I've seen is where he says, "Okay, let's do that again, but make it good."
Right.
Because that's as much he says he's going to tell you is what is make it good, and there's a truth to that, I think, where you just maybe you can't put it into words why something worked for you, to make it part of the object, but it just did, and there's no kind of sense of explaining that. Writers get put in a weird position. Like we don't go up to musicians who, in essence, improvise and say what made you go to that key, or it's just taken for what it is, and you're not asked to explain afterwards why you went in a certain direction.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, in one hand, I feel like a lot of people who consume media have been trained to expect really simplistic stories and answers, of like, oh, well, what happened, and yet the artists who are truly original, truly themselves, have this vision that is not really informed by that sort of really simplistic either story structure or thematic, tropes that we are used to encountering. So I think you've really hit on like a super important um, piece of the success of this. I want to back up because you mentioned Naked Singularity. I was one of the ones who was lucky to receive one of the first copies of that book that was sent out in 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. And, it took a while for that book to get popular recognition and to be picked up by University of Chicago Press, and then it was lauded appropriately. But that was years after you wrote the book, and so I want to ask you a little bit about your career trajectory and like you're starting up. You have a law degree, you're practicing attorney in New York. Um, you know, Back us up a little bit of what you always wanted to be a writer. You had this fiction project in mind. Did it come to you on the job and say, I'm going to find the time to make this work, outside of my day job?
Um, I think in many ways the writing certainly predated practicing law. It didn't, and in many ways I always had that dual desire. I very much enjoy the legal profession and practicing law, especially the way that I get to. I'm fortunate enough to do it. Um,
Which is a public defender, right?
yeah, I'm a public defender in Manhattan. So so when I think of, I mean, it wasn't a big leap for me to say at some point I'll sit down and really focus on a novel. Um, and there was certainly a recognition on my part that like this life I'm living right now happens to be good material. Like it merged these two things. I mean, clients of which I back then had a seemingly unendless flow of are inherently fascinating people. The situation we were in was, I mean, oppressive. I use the past tense. It's better now. It's not all that better, but it's an oppressive situation, and it lent itself to what I wanted to do with that novel.
And then you had this gap, right, between writing the book and just saying, independently publishing it, I would say, and then, building up a sort of core readership. And how did it eventually find its place where it is now in its readership?
So I finished it in 2005, and I literally know nobody in publishing. Don't really even know how it works or how it worked. It was 20 years ago. I said, so what happens now? Obviously, this will be in bookstores and will be a big deal. But what am I supposed to do? And so I followed what was the process then, which I assume isn't it. And there was just like dead silence. Like nobody was really interested in it. And you mentioned 2008. My wife basically said, well, just publish it yourself, which I was like, that seems kind of icky. Not what I grew up kind of valorizing. I was pretty rather disappointed in kind of publishing in general, which is it's like there's a lot of that in my latest book too. Just the loss of institutions that maybe you admired at one point. I think of like in my other world, the Supreme Court or the
Yeah.
White House, whatever that means. Like not human beings, but like institutions that you need
Police.
to have
Yeah.
faith in. And in every arc, you'll see they'll be like, well, we go to the police, right? And they're like, the police? Like who
Hmm.
takes the police seriously? And that's how I kind of felt about publishing at that point, which is like, well, I mean, you're telling me that like every of the 100,000 books published this year is better than this, or is it just not have anything to do with that? So my wife, back then, self-publishing was, actually making physical copies of the book, which I was grateful for. I very much wanted to see it. So we did that. And then what you're referring to, Matt, is that I think back then, and still to the best criticism is it was happening even then online. And so she would, well, maybe this isn't everybody's cup of tea, but these kind of people seem to have a affinity for something that is like the tradition you're working in, and would send those out, and that ultimately led to University of Chicago reaching out. And in my other world as a lawyer, we have this thing called it's crossed over into the pop world too of making a record or preserving the record, where we say, hey, I just want to make sure this trial is happening now. I just want to make sure everybody understands this is what you're doing, Judge. This is going to be looked at later on, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that this is what you're doing. I kind of felt that way in the literary world too. So, when Chicago said, yeah, we'll publish it, I said, well, you're going to publish the exact same book that I self-published. We're not going to sit down. We're not going to talk about editing. We're not going to talk about even typos. We're just putting it. I
Just
want
send
the
it. Yeah.
record to be clear that this is exactly the same book that drove me to near insanity 4 years ago. So, yeah, I'm a petty person that way.
Well, I
At the
I think
And they were like, cool, we don't have to spend any money to do any more work on it. We'll do it. Boom.
ship it. Yeah.
Yeah.
my impression is that, and I worked in publishing in New York for a while, and my own sense of things, and I still have a lot of friends who jump from job to job in publishing, is that things have only gotten worse, and it's only harder for people who write the way that you do to find legitimate publishing options. And I'm very I'm somewhat more pessimistic about publishing than I've ever been. And the stigma of like self publishing, I think, is hopefully getting less so. And that with music or film, if you go out and self finance a film, um, no one is going to look at you and say, well, that film is less great because you self financed it.
I think it's on the contrary. I think we kind of assume it'll be better.
Right.
Like I remember
Right.
Robert Rodriguez, man, he made this movie on his credit card. Yeah, I want
Right.
to see that. But
Yeah.
Must be great.
publishing's always had this kind of allure
Gatekeeping.
of approval.
Right.
Oh my God, we're being approved. Writers tend to be very insecure. It's the nature of the activity, unfortunately. So I want that approval. Now I agree with you that maybe big publishing is not even as good a place as it was in 2005. For example, back then it was the big six. Now it's five. Soon it'll be whatever.
Two.
Almost making four. But I will say that the rise of the small press is something that causes optimism for me. For example, I served a couple of years ago on the jury for one of these foundations, Best Translated Literature.
Oh, right, yeah.
I think the entire, what's it called when they narrow it down to something?
Long
Short list.
list.
Yeah, the
Oh, the
long list
short list.
and the short list were all independent presses. And
Oh,
that
cool.
wasn't an intent on our part to make that happen. But when we looked up and said, that's where the most interesting work is, screw it. I don't care if Penguin Random House is like bludgeoning me over the head with this new thing. The best work is coming from these places, and that filled me with joy.
Right. And so Naked Singularity is a pretty fat book for people who haven't read it. It's a thicker book.
Like 670 something, I think.
Lost Empress is a thicker book. I really love Lost Empress, by the way. We could
Oh,
do
yeah.
another hour on Lost Empress. I really love that
Yes,
book.
please.
Personae is a shorter book. This book, in comparison, is a shorter book, but that to me seems a very surface level way of talking about these books, and that I personally don't really fetishize a short book or a long book. I'm looking for ideas and characters, and all of your books are really
Humor.
rich in that. But do you have any response to someone who would say like, "Oh, are you just alternating a fat book with a thin book and going back to a thin book?"
That's basically coincidence. So Naked Singularity, I found I couldn't really progress on the second book in the mental state I was in, which was essentially anger, not a great place to work from. But once I made the deal with University of Chicago, then I could turn my attention to Persona, which I had been roiling around in there. This notion of like, what is literary influence? How does it emerge? And a bunch of other million things going through my head at once. And I think that book had to be fragmentary and had to be that way that it is. Um, and similarly with this one, I wanted something that could be read in like 4 hours. I wanted to I wanted the continuous. I mean, back to that theme, but I wanted it to feel like an experience that could be ingested all at once, and then maybe for some they'd start it again. Whereas with Lost Empress, certainly it's about maybe living with it for a few weeks,
Yeah.
and because its scope is, for lack of more nuance, like American society, a big subject, right? Something like that, and then I think that for that kind of book, you live with it for a few weeks, and hopefully it maybe makes you see things that were visible but not front and center in your mind. With this, I wanted an early title for it was Bullet. I wanted it to feel like something that had its own momentum and that you were just kind of like swept up in it,
It's
and
being
that's hard
shot
to do.
down to the bottom of the ocean
Yeah,
in a metal casing.
yeah. I wanted the what the fuck sensation, and it's
I
easier.
sure had that from this
Yeah,
book. Yeah.
and that I think lends itself to a shorter work. Um, I don't know. I'm kind of working on something now, but I'm not viewing it yet from the perspective of, well, is it 800 pages or is it 200 pages or is it that? That's something that kind of emerges early on, but not is not the
First thing.
instigating force. Yeah.
Yeah. You get a sense of the scope like as you're writing it versus like I'm gonna set out to write a 600-page novel.
Yeah.
It just
Look, I
becomes
mean,
what it becomes organically.
I'm all about freedom.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel like something beyond me is dictating where I go with things. But yeah, it's a weird alternating thing that has emerged, and certainly if the next one's really long, it'll be in everybody's That's what he does. He alternates, but I don't know. I
Well,
can't really say.
I just had to ask. We haven't said much about the actual book under discussion here. So, for people who have not read the book, I will summarize it as best as I can very briefly. It's about a guy named Riv, who is a private detective who goes from New York to Cali, Colombia, sort of his ancestral homeland. And while he's there, he sort of gets put on this case or asked to take up the disappearance of a young girl named Angelica. And that's the whole not the whole book. That's a lot of the story, the plot line of what you're talking about. That's driving this sort of lightning fast. What happens next? And maybe I'm a slow reader, but I spent more than 4 hours with this book, so
Yeah, I'd say
I,
so too.
I enjoyed it, and I always read with a pencil, so I spend a lot of time making notes. And I would say, my first note on this book was dreamlike quality,
Hmm.
and you mentioned that about Lynch, but I wonder if it has something to do just with the setup of a sort of stranger in a strange land, or a stranger comes to town out of his element a bit. If you've traveled in a foreign land, it can feel like you're not in reality at that point. Um, is that based in somewhat of a reality for you of traveling abroad and feeling that displacement?
I mean, when I've gone to Cali many times, and that's definitely, I think the narrator says this city has like a dreamlike quality for me at all times, and not dreamlike like necessarily a positive.
Yeah,
Right.
There are
right.
nightmares too.
So there's a lot of violence
Yeah, there's a lot of
underlying.
violence,
Yeah.
and look, I mean, Marquez was onto something, that there's a great belief in the atypical. Let me put it that way. A great, you will be like when the hotel owner comes to him and starts telling him about
Ghosts.
the,
Yeah.
let's call it, supernatural status of the hotel he's staying at. That's done with a complete straight face, as if you were describing replacing our carburetor. You know what I mean? And that's just like accepted. And I know we're doing probably too much
Right.
on Lynch, but that's kind of Lynchian too, right? Where like the oddest stuff are happening, and people are just like accepting that that's the reality. That's how I feel when I'm in that city. So that was very intentional to take off on that. About, I think Mauro's his cousin says to him something like, once they realize what is really seems to be involved, is like, look, there's this whole other world that exists that is horrifying, and you don't step into that world unless you're compelled to do that. And that's his biggest kind of objection that he lodges against Riff, to saying you're kind of like, this is just the world that we all know exists, but we try to avoid.
Yeah.
And you're purposely dipping a toe in it, and that's not the way, and that's why, and it doesn't work out.
Right. Yeah.
Well, in Colombia, I grew up in the 80s, and I'm dating myself a bit here, but the reputation of Colombia was pretty sinister in the 80s, and, informed by movies, Romancing the Stone, I'm thinking of,
The
and
war on
that
drugs,
it was this
probably
sort
too.
of great. Americans didn't go to Colombia in the
No,
80s,
no.
and it was considered to be, the way maybe Juarez was for a while, of considered to be the most dangerous place on earth. And, how did that inform you as a child or growing up in the US, New York, New Jersey, of thinking, man, Colombia must be, it's mythological. It's almost so dangerous.
It is mythological, but I'd be the one saying I've been there 4 times. I don't know what you're talking about.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Right. Yeah.
I see that now. Like,
Sensationalism.
Yeah.
New York City's falling apart. Really? I just sat on a fucking outdoor cafe for 4 hours with a croissant. How is New York City falling apart? So there's an element of that. But look,
Yeah. Yeah.
the reality is there was, as often is the case with Colombia, a very troubled, violent, and it was centered around two main cities, Cali and Medellin. And I was going to Cali fairly frequently. If you were in Bogota, the capital, um, things were a lot more ordered. The problem with Colombia is that there's just uninhabitable parts of the country. The nature is really the main chief protagonist in Colombia. Um, Unbound, uncontrolled.
I,
And
and that is actually brings me to a question I had for you, which is like, is that why you wanted to include the maps at the beginning and the maps of
Oh
Colombia?
yeah.
I mean, look, I got to say, my publisher was great with this book. Asking people to put themselves in the city. I thought, that I keep mentioning there's kind of like a bit of a, not satire, but a nod to like these travel logs, because the narrator himself's like, I want to pretend to be a tourist. Here's what
Yeah.
a
Right.
tourist is doing. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to be able to center all that with a map? And I just kind of like haltingly said that while meeting with the publisher. Them expecting it to be like, dude, you're gonna sell 50 books. We're not putting no fucking map in it. But they were like, yeah, we'll do that. That's done. And I was like, cool. Well, then let's play with that and make it kind of jokey, like the kind of map you see when you arrive at Adventureland, where they have like a little photo of the roller coaster, and you walk towards that direction. Let's make it that kind of map. And again, they were just like, cool, we're in. So yeah, look, I mean, the the state of the book is supposed to be a dream state. Um, it in dreams things don't necessarily often make sense. There's wild jumps that make sense to you as you're
Yeah.
experiencing the dream, but then later on you're like, why did that scare me? That could never happen. So there's that element to that city. It's gorgeous city. I love it at the same time as I, on some level, fear it.
Well, that part of the sort of the mystery of nature is mentioned in the book.
Yeah, that
The
becomes
nature
large
of
at the
mystery,
end.
they sort of go hand in hand. And this, there's a line later on in the book. The context is a little different, and it's regarding science, and it says something like scientists drain the mystery out of life.
Yeah, page
And
180.
there's
I wrote that
some,
too.
you wrote that, yeah, there's something in there about, that's vital. Human knowledge is tied up with trying to understand mysteries, and in a way this is a mystery novel, right? We've got a
Yeah,
detective, we've got a
detective. Yeah.
missing girl, sort of damsel in distress story. But that compelling idea, it's a very literary idea of what happens, like this mystery. That curiosity is what drives scientists on this hand, but also artists and thinkers and writers on this other hand. So, I mean, could you speak to that a little bit about throughout your work? That's sort of a theme, but also particularly with being sort of out of the US mostly in this book. Is there something more? I don't know what it is because there's this religion element here too I want to get to, about God and the nature of mystery is very tied up with religion, especially in Colombia. That's very different than the US, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at like the history of thought, it's God being replaced by reason, being replaced by science, and then now we're all waiting for it to be replaced by Chat GPT or something. You know,
AI.
I mean, look, famously,
Mathematics is
this
the
is
new
why
key.
Angelica gets offended. Famously, science can't answer the why questions, right? So it can go and tell you the planets do this, and this is the Big Bang, this is how we think the universe started, and then you can kind of like just take the cornerstone out of the whole thing at the end by just saying, but why? Right? So I think like Mondragon, who's the person I think who says that, is fascinated with kind of metaphor and enacting them. Um,
Not to
No
spoil
doubt.
it, but
Yeah.
right, not to
yes.
spoil it, but
Spoiler shield here.
I'm not too worried about that. But he is fascinated by kind of performing these metaphors, oftentimes quite
Quite
literally.
literally, yeah.
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 Whereas Angelica is probably more like just wants science to run everything. Let science run it. Nobody will ever run a bus into a frozen lake. The errors will be removed. And I think Riv is just sitting there saying, like, I'm not loving either of these worldviews. I don't know what the fuck is going on. And so that's presented, I think, hopefully in an organic way, as I think the why questions are mainly what interests artists. Hard to make great art about, well, here's how a planet orbits. What we do is
Yeah. Here.
we take off from there into what we hope are larger questions.
Yeah.
I think Angelica would say that there are no questions. It's just, you know, ask all your questions you want. It's a meaningless activity. What matters, and I think both Mondragon and Angelica would say, is power, exerting it over others, achieving your even basest goals.
Hmm.
Well, and it brings me to this sort of search for meaning or understanding or search for truth is what I think draws some writers to the idea of a detective story, and that a detective is looking for what really happened. And a
Well, I'm
right,
gonna say something like that.
right,
Every writer is essentially a detective, so the detective story is kind of perfectly conducive to that. I think he said something like that.
right, and that I guess when you see savage detectives, like that's not really a detective story in the same way. And it's like, is he serious
Right.
here? Does he really want to be a detective? And I think that he did. I think that he really did want to be a detective. And it's because there is some sort of search for truth involved, right? It's some sort of, you're writing this narrative of, there's a clear linear story, right? Like, I'm giving this case, there's going to be a resolution to it. What happens in the middle is like you get to
Well,
sort of
yeah.
act it out.
I think Riv says to Mauda something like, Mauda says to him, "Okay, we're done. We know she is dead. You promised her mother you would get her back, and so there's nothing left to do." He goes, "I didn't promise her I would get her back. I promised she would know what happened.
Right.
I promised her truth, and we don't have truth, and that's why we're going to continue." And I think, yeah, there's a sense in that too. The artist, whatever their medium, has to be seeking that, has to be seeking truth on some level. Maybe take the most mundane definition of it, like a detective literally has a mundane definition. I just need to tell this person what happened to her daughter. I'm not responsible for what happened to her daughter. I can't change, but she's entitled to that truth. And that to me was moving and just felt right. It felt true.
Yeah.
It's a self-rewarding thing, when you read something, or you even something as base as a comedian. Oftentimes we're laughing at a comedian. You're saying, "Oh yeah, that is true. I just never thought about it, but it's true, and that's fun. Well, it's true because it's funny. It's funny because it's true. Whatever." I think that that's one of our responsibilities, is to give it to the at least to our understanding at the moment of what it is, meaning truth. Um, it may not strike someone else as true, but the real betrayal would be as if you put it out there, but it doesn't strike you as true. And
Right.
that's not to say that I don't put, thoughts in my characters that I don't agree with. I clearly, I must be doing that because the characters themselves don't agree with each other. So, but I do think the detective process is a perfect metaphor for what we're doing.
All right. I think that that's super. There's so many directions you can go from that, from any sort of subject in life almost. And this being a shorter book, that's why I think quality versus quantity. Maybe it doesn't really matter how long the book is. It's sort of the ideas that it's illustrating, and that being a super important one. And also, as things progress in the narrative, there's a little bit of a debate with the Colombianos about. I'm thinking of this conversation with Fercho where he gets into a debate about fate, and that's one of the sections of 2666 too, is like the part about fate. And the fate part is that it's a feeling of loss of control, like, oh, maybe the gods are still in charge, or whatever's going to happen is already fated. But it's also mixed in with this sort of other uncontrollable idea, which is like luck, and like, oh, right place at the right time, like things are, you're either lucky or you're not, and it's sort of like out of human control for what your fate is, if you're just unlucky or not. And could you speak to that idea a little bit as it relates to this particular detective story?
I think fate is a complete cop out. Whenever I encounter it in a narrative, for example, like in the Matrix or in like the recent Star Wars, like, don't you understand that Keanu Reeves is whatever the one, or don't you understand that she's actually a Jedi and she's fated to be this? Well, then what the fuck am I watching for?
You
If,
know
it,
how
if,
it's
it's
going
a
to end, right?
if it's a predetermined world, right, then it loses all, not just suspense. At the most obvious level, it loses suspense, but it also loses what makes art, and it loses the kind of beauty and juice of the whole thing called living, to me.
Right.
So I just don't understand. It's kind of like a prequel. Also, prequels, like, I can only enjoy them to a point, and then I'm like, I know
Right.
what's gonna happen to this person because I watched the movie where he's doing a
He's
million
still
things.
alive.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
still alive.
So why would you? Narratives are beautiful things. I'm addicted to them. I take them in every form, including really base forms like the two movies I just mentioned. But at the same time, why are you undercutting your own work with this notion? And I think that it's a way of opting out of your own life in many ways. And it's not true to our lived experience. Similarly, what's not true, like another thing you lost me, is this person's dead. Oh, but they're not really dead. Well, like the
Yeah.
character's here, he's a ghost or whatever. They're not really dead. Well, that's what fucking makes life so painful, is that death is permanent. You don't get to talk to that person again. So if you introduce that element where death isn't really death, then I don't feel like you have much to tell me about this thing I'm going through right now, because in this thing, it's undeniable that death is death.
It's
And that
final. Yeah.
fucking fact is one of the things that makes life so harrowing, having to say goodbye to people and knowing
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
So I put Fate in that category, prequels, Death Isn't Really Death, Don't Worry. I put all that in the same, like, narrative blunders that no matter how good the rest of the work is, my heart sinks. Not my heart, because I'm usually not invested enough, but like
Yeah.
my spirit sinks. I'm like, okay, this is not serious work. And I think um, I don't, Mondragon is in those instances he's kind of messing with Riv, um, and he's supposedly a believer in fate. As many successful people are, if you hear them talk, and he used the word successful here on a base vile level, but success, whatever you want to call it, they always have the story. When I was 3, my mother said, "You will one day."
Yeah.
Yeah, this was fated.
The messianic prophecy.
That's almost that. Yeah, thank you. That's almost as popular as like everybody was against me. Nobody was against you. You know, they said I couldn't do it. Nobody said that. You listen to these professional athletes. Everybody knew they were going to be professional athletes by the time they were like 12. Yet to hear them say it, nobody knew I'd be here. Nobody could believe it. I don't know what that human temptation is to want to make your story somehow fit into these categories. When in reality, like you were probably born on third base, and you made it halfway to home. Congrats.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
There's this great line Mondragon says, he says, "You're adorable, Riv, you know that? Understand that this vessel is about to have its fuse lit so it can be forcefully launched into the corpse of all it means to be human." And without giving too much away about the plot and what the vessel is, that kind of speaks to this question of like, what is kind of the finality of human knowledge? Can we understand and ascertain everything about this natural world? And Mondragon seems to be on a quest to eradicate or sort of explode and have something final to say about evolution and
Right. No, and I think that
horror.
that is
You know,
that I like that part too because Riv is like basically saying, I don't think I'll get another sub, guys. I'm good. Like, I don't even know if he's joking or not, but Mongo's like, boy, you kind of really think you have a choice in this matter. You're coming on this thing the way Ahab went down with that whale, whether you like it or not. You can be inside or you can be outside. And yeah, look, I mean, the reality of life, what we constantly come up with is that there are people with power over our lives. Um, we're about to be really painfully reminded of that fact tomorrow here in
Powerful.
the
Yeah.
U.S.
Yeah.
Um, and they don't use that power responsibly. That's kind of like the history of mankind.
yeah, and maybe that's just the general fate of us all, right? Is that we
Yeah,
are just small, tiny forces that just get kind of dragged along by things way bigger than us. We have no
yeah,
control
and I
over.
think he definitely finds that out
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
the hard way.
Yeah,
There's
But
enough.
there's courage in him, and there's
yeah, for sure.
um, a kind of steely acceptance of that stuff that I respond to.
And a lot of like smart alecky witticism in the face of this impending kind of doom and horror and death, and
He has the
it's
power
very
of language. He has
yeah,
it more even than this guy, and he's going down with that one tool.
yeah. This is one of my favorite features of your writing, Sergio. Is like you have this like very playful kind of dialogic element to to the spoken words of your characters in your books, and this is true of all your novels. It's kind of like Socratic dialogue with a side of smart aleck. Um, and I think that no one that I can think of who writes books contemporarily writes as funny dialogue as you do. Um, Take us through a little bit of like what is your? I mean, I get the sense that you have like a strong philosophical background. Like you've studied philosophy, you've studied like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and the dialogues and stuff like that. How did that sort of inform your artistic sense as you write?
Yes, I was a philosophy student at a really good program at Rutgers in
Oh,
the
okay, yeah.
early '90s. Yeah,
It
and
shows then, yeah.
what's interesting about the Socratic dialogues is it's just like, by and large, what they what they do is they remove from you this notion that you understand something. So, we're like almost every platonic dialogue is like, "Hey, that guy's really brave." Well, what makes you say that? Well, he acted bravely this time. Well, what's bravery? And so, like,
Yeah.
I do. I mean, that's at its most superficial level. But yeah, there's a lot of that going on. I love. It's really fun when you get to write humor. And you say, well, you get to write it whenever you want. Yeah, but you can't really. I mean, I'm not looking for like a purely comic novel.
Right.
So it's about But there are different kinds, and I think the humor in A Naked Singularity is basically gallows humor. Like, holy shit, we're all
Totally.
fucked. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
and then whereas with Lost Empress, there's a bit of that kind of screwball slapstick stuff that
Mhm.
eventually will come to meet up with reality. But for a lot of time, it's just like fun. It's just that, it's not necessarily in service of anything else other than just enjoyable. Because I like reading funny things, I like
Yeah.
writing them and things of that nature. But and life, I think that a work that pretends that there's no such thing as humor at all or compassion or these
Yeah.
other is just as unrealistic as a Pollyannish work that pretends that everything's going to be fine and
Hmm.
everything is fine now, right? I mean, neither one is, I think, realistic to what we are experiencing daily. And there's no need that a novelist creating a novel doesn't have any special fidelity to reality, um, but it is nice to have the sensation of recognition, which is that like sometimes you're at a funeral and people laugh.
Yeah.
As much as
Totally.
you don't deny it, it's just a reality. And I think that works that.
I was just going to say there is a scene in this book that is at a funeral home, and I found that to be actually really funny. Maybe one of the funniest parts of the book because Riv, our main character, is going into this funeral home not to pick up cremated remains or even a body, but to get a book and a letter that they're going to bury in lieu of a body. And I mean, that's just such a funny metaphor. And the process of him explaining that he's there to get a book and a letter, I found that was a really funny scene. Even though I would say the tone of the book is very like hard boiled, like this hard boiled detective story. And that's one thing I did love about also Lost Empress is that tone was very kind of like you said screwball and silly in some places, and that was a lot of fun. I could tell. I love it when a writer clearly is having fun with their own writing,
Yeah.
and I think that makes it more enjoyable for the reader. So I did want to ask you about the tone of it a bit. I will say the other thing I thought was humorous, and I might be totally alone in this, is that at some point reading it, I felt like there was a parallel with the Big Lebowski, where like maybe she kidnapped herself, dude. And, and I was just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh man, this is great. This is great because that movie too, like this book, is less interested in like the actual narrative of the plot. It's a
Yeah.
character driven story, right? Where like even if she did kidnap herself, it's still going to end with the dude at a bowling alley. Like that's not the
Yeah.
end of the story, as her the resolving of the kidnapping or whatever with that story. So there was
My
some
favorite of
funny.
that is when they steal his car, which is worth like $50, and he goes to the pound and he says, "Yo, man, like any leads?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, we'll get the report from the boys at the lab any minute now."
They got us working in shifts.
Yeah, any leads, man? Um, so
Leads.
yeah, I forgot your question because that is such a.
No, I was just saying that the tone of it. I do think there's humorous parts of it, just because I think that's sort of inextricable from. There's a Wittgenstein reference in here, and it's sort of Wittgenstein in wordplay, and any serious thing is sort of told in a joking way. And there's sort of a way like you can't just go up to your friend and be like, "Hey, you still believe in God, right?" Like this would be like in a
Right.
joke, like to approach something really serious.
That'd be ironic, yeah.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
there's that tone of it. Maybe if you could just speak to that a little bit. Like clearly, you had to get your mind in a certain mood to sort of capture this character.
I mean, I think the key to the character in a lot of ways is the first words out of his mouth is like, from this moment on, I believe in nothing. And it doesn't mean that there's nothing I believe in. I believe in that thing called nothing.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like back to Lebowski, like the nihilists who are fucking rug that really tied the room together. Um, so I think at that point, he's proceeding as if like I'm comfortable with my death. I'm not sure I can effectuate it myself, but I'm not tied to life the way the average person is. And that's why like if my last act on earth is um, finding out what is true about this one thing, I'm comfortable with that. And I think that that informs the you mentioned the hard boiled thing. Obviously, I'm making use of a well established trope, um, which is, especially I think often portrayed like disillusionment following the world wars, and like essentially anything's possible now, and can you believe, and this just keeps getting worse and worse. I'm playing with that trope, and maybe um, making it similar to stuff all my novels are gonna, the main characteristic about them is that they're gonna be my novels, and they're gonna kind of portray this worldview I have, or this bent that I tend to enact when writing, and so I think that the four novels seem very similar to me in that they have these approaches.
Yeah, that's like Riv says on 41. And if I end up dead as a result, well, then at least I won't have to live anymore.
Yeah.
You know, he's a very ambivalent kind of
There's a suicide
perspective on.
throughout the letter that he's getting from the is it's clearly a fake. It's resonating with him, and I think if you read the letter, you'll see kind of a lot of famous examples of what suicides have written, or famous suicides, and it's. I think he's making some connection, and he's understanding that because he's well read and he knows what these are, but he's not quite doing the work to put it in to words what it is that is to him untrustworthy about this letter, and why he immediately believes it's not genuine.
And my advice to anyone reading this book is also to, you mentioned this earlier, but like, go back and read some of the beginning pages again. I think that they have more meaning, and I noticed things on a second reread of even the first couple of chapters that clearly you just couldn't pick up if you're reading it for the first time. So the one of that is the arc. And I wanted to ask you about arcs, character arcs, arc of the universe. There's this quote from Martin Luther King: "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Every
Maybe an arc with a K.
Unfortunately,
what?
I don't think I believe that anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas,
Yeah. It's getting harder and harder these days, it feels like.
yeah, I think there was a time that I would have definitely agreed with that sentiment, but now it feels like wishful thinking sometimes.
Well, in that
Arc,
idea, is it true? Like, does every arc bend its radian? I don't know if that's true.
I don't know if it's true either. I don't think I've ever made a so-called factual claim in my title. Um, it's the kind of factual claim that has a truth value, unlike, for example, their eyes were watching God, a tree grows in Brooklyn. We don't have too many declarative statement novels anymore.
That's true.
Um, but
A heartbreaking work of staggering genius.
That's not a complete sentence.
no, yeah. I mean like one that makes a claim about truth. That's like a naked singularity. That's
Yeah, yeah.
um, or but I think it's fitting that a detective novel's title make a factual claim and there be no answer to it. It's really a nonsensical question. If there was a mathematician here amongst us, they'd be like, "You're just playing with fun words that you like," and I'd be like, "Yes, guilty. I'm just playing with fun words that I like that are evocative of what's about to."
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But
What about if we change arc to arc with a K, and how that might sort of lend itself to the submarine ending of the book? At
Yeah, well, I think
submarine as a kind of an arc.
comes out with something that says, "Here's the new Ark of the Covenant."
Yeah,
To with some gold Ark comes out,
yeah, or like Noah's Ark too.
or like
this
Noah's Ark as well.
this
Yeah, that's
watery
it.
vessel that
Yeah,
takes humanity somewhere further. You know.
right. And I think that like really, I mean, I've thought about this afterwards. Like, what does Mondragon really want to do? And it's just like he wants to bring monsters back.
Yeah,
And
literally
at a
goddamn
basic level, he
creatures.
wants to bring monsters that exist, not create them. They exist. We just don't see them. And he wants to bring them. And Rib's like, what is that? Like, just you just want all this has been about like a zoo. Like you want to have like a really the coolest zoo. And he probably that's all he does want.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
Angelica obviously has far more. Mondragon's desires are essentially artistic and metaphorical. They're just bad art, and they're bad. They're not. They're not morally defensible art, but in a weird way, he is centered around a kind of art. I don't think Angelica has anything beyond like computational goals almost.
yeah.
Can be, um, yeah,
I laughed out loud at the phrase on 211 where he calls these sea creatures literally goddamn creatures. And like literally is a word that has gone too far
Yeah, I know.
in linguistic state of things. But I laugh so hard at that. What is like? Have you done much? What is your preoccupation with like the deep sea and deep sea life?
Complete and
Is
utter
this?
fear. I
Yeah, that
and
comes across pretty
part
well.
of this was like me kind of trying to deal with my almost phobias. Yeah, the sea scare.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, this deep sea scares the hell out of me. Um,
yeah. There's a very existential quality to this place that we
no question.
is with us on the planet, but we can't get to. Like
Right.
we know more
I think
about
Mondragon
the
says we're going
universe.
there because we're going to the center. We're going towards the center. But when they went to the moon, for example, we knew we weren't finding life. We knew there wasn't anything. We knew we were essentially visiting a stone. But where we're going to see life at its elemental form. And where we're going is we're getting into the heart of the matter, like you mentioned, bullet being fired to what means we're going to our origin as human beings.
Yeah,
This is at least generally accepted the origin of life, right? Um, but all those things that he's saying, they're like aesthetic statement. Um, they're not science, at least at their core. It's about his ego and that gratification.
it's kind of like an Elon Musk element
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
Mondragon.
And like you write these things, and I finished the book a couple of years ago, and then there was a billionaire, right, who went down in a submersible, and it didn't go well for them.
Right, exactly.
Like, and then maybe like while we're editing or while we're working with the publisher, the Chat GPT thing gets announced, and it's like so somebody asked me, are these things in reaction to that? And it's just like, look, man, a novel takes years. They're in the can a lot earlier than you think they are, than before they hit bookstores. And just the novel's not the instrument for that. It's not the instrument for reacting to current events, generally speaking, just because of the time lag. But it is interesting when things like that happen.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. Would this be a good time for you to read a section of your new book for us on air, Sergio? Would you be cool with
If you
that?
have a copy nearby.
Yeah, give me a second while I
We can
get.
ship you one if not.
All right, so when Riv arrives in Gali, it turns out he doesn't have an answer to the simple question they ask you at the airport about where you will be staying. This actually happened to me when I went to London for some kind of book event, and I got to customs and I said, okay, so where will you be staying? And I was like, I have no idea. And the guy didn't believe me, and I was like, well, I don't know. People kind of tell me where to go, and I just go, and then they point me in a certain direction. I had no idea where I was staying, no idea what the festival was called or anything of that nature. I had to like resort to Google, I think, to have them believe who I was and let me into their country. I wasn't even that thrilled to be in their country, but there it was. That happened here too as well. Anyway, he ends up at this hotel and doesn't think anything much of it, other than I believe there's an odd symbol above the hotel, which would make sense. Um, so this is him now speaking. The hotel is haunted. This is fact, not opinion. The tall suit with the intimidating woman inside is explaining this to me. Not because I've betrayed any interest in the topic, just to kill time while her co-workers co-work to rectify the problem. The problem is that I am in almost tearful need of my bed, their bed, and the access key that worked fine this morning won't work now when the stakes are much higher. The spirits grant or deny access at their discretion, she says. I've probably heard how Colombia is known for its haunted hotels. Everyone wants to talk about the Santa Clara in Cartagena, a former 17th century monastery, and it is beautiful and it is haunted. But the spirit world has no less of a geography than our own. Do I understand? I tell her I do, so she'll stop, but instead it functions as a kind of invitation. For example, you're American, yes? Are the States and Colombia the same? Surely you see the profound differences. Why do people think the spiritual world functions otherwise? Tell me, would you rather live in a Bolivian penitentiary or in a Tuscan village? This place has been here in some form for all of the city's almost 500 years. Imagine the events that have occurred here. This very spot we now stand on. You can feel it if you try. This is no pearl of beauty in Tuscany. Looks fine. And what do you tell me of people? Are all people the same? No one would say they are, but what happens when we picture phantasms? Always stupidly project uniformity when we picture the unknown, like when space invaders or people from the future all dress and look alike. The story here is worse even than allowed by human imagination. The same we just said is so weak it can't even conceive how the world of spirits is as rich and varied as our own. Now imagine the kind of ghosts the slave trade produced. You're thinking of the victims, and in the case of Cartagena, the major Colombian slave port, you would be right. But you know who lived here, where we now stand? The same devils who've always lived in Cali, the architects of pandemonium. Okay, you know about pandemonium. Then you know that when God defeated and cast out the rebellious Satan, he and his minions of fallen angels had to regroup and plan their next move. Coming to in hell, Satanas called for the formation of a council. This demonic council would advise on the best course of action, so long as it was steeped in vengeance. The resulting debate was held in Pandemonium, the newly created palace and capital of hell. Less known is the fact that the response they decided on, perverting human affairs at every turn, required an earthly base of operations. Just then, blessedly, a new key card arrives. Now she's simultaneously letting me in and telling me I should check out the next morning. Do you understand what I've been explaining? She wonders. I don't believe in haunted places or the spirits who would do it. Truth? Truth. Places are just that. Do you have a childhood home? A what? Where you grew up? Yes. If I told you today it was going to be destroyed tomorrow for firewood, would you want to see it one last time? You would, because places and locations have spirits, no different than you. The hotel is haunted, you're saying. More than that, the hotel is pandemonium on earth. No, the hotel's not haunted? It is, but only because of where it is. I see. Cali's haunted. No, the entire valley. Can't you tell? That the entire valley is haunted or infernal? No. This is one of the most naturally beautiful places on earth. Explain that. Nothing to explain if you're familiar with the ways of Satan. And you only see beauty because you're unaware of everything that's happened here, especially the rivers. Should I put you down for checkout tomorrow morning? Boy, the owners must love you. I am the owner.
That's great. I love that so much.
Thank you,
And I had underlined several parts of that passage when I was first reading it. And, you know, one of them is just the sort of matter-of-fact statement that the place is haunted,
Yeah.
but also that, like, oh, Satan exists. And I remember reading an interview with, you mentioned the Supreme Court earlier, with Antonin Scalia. And the interviewer was sort of shocked that was like, you actually believe in the devil? And and you know, Scalia said something like, well, that's like Christianity 101. Like, you have to believe that, you know, Satan is real, the devil is real, and this is just, it was a matter of fact. And it's like, these are the people making the highest laws in our land, and they're speaking about, you know, the way that you're speaking about a haunted hotel owner in Cali, Colombia. And, you know, that sort of,
And Cali is a. I think if he said Christian 101, he's wrong. He should have said Catholicism 101,
there
which
you
he
go.
was. And Cali is a hot, you know, Catholicism is still a very powerful force there. And this is kind of what he says later on. I think Riv says something like, they tell him it's New Year's, you eat grapes, and then that gives you good luck for the coming year. And he says, you know, like the first time you hear something like that, you're just like, enough. Then it's the second time, and you're like, well, this is like the 100th time now I've heard something like this, and you just start accepting that reality maybe is different here than it is in Times Square.
Right.
And that's one of the early ones where it's just like, yeah, you're saying these things in a matter of fact way, like everybody accepts this to be true.
Right.
And if you know, and maybe like when you first land, you're like, oh, God, but you know, after you've been there a couple weeks, and it's different, you know, and that's how I felt. That's how I feel about this place in like my life, right? So like my entire family here, I have a very large extended family, but high majority of them were born in Colombia and then came to live here. So they didn't change because they moved their address. They're Colombian, man, and I'm steeped in that culture, and there is that element to it that is at a minimum entertaining. But
Right.
you know, I think
I eat a lot of grapes, is what I'm saying. It's
Yeah.
a very tongue-in-cheek,
Yeah.
funny line there.
Yeah, at the end you're just like,
Yeah, like this.
really? Give me the damn grapes.
Yeah.
You know, New Year's wasn't that long ago. My sister's like, where are the damn grapes? And I said, come on, the grapes? What? New Year's.
Yeah.
She wanted to have them, and it's just like, I get, of course, like we eat the grapes and nothing great happens during the year. But we line up to have more grapes.
No, in the U.S. or in the South where I'm at, I mean, I grew up that way with black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, and it's
Oh,
like you have to
really?
eat black-eyed peas. I mean,
Oh, I've never heard of this.
you never
What?
heard of black-eyed peas? Oh, good.
Well, I've heard of black-eyed peas, but not this
On New Year's
tradition
Day?
associated with New Year's. No.
so I like, isn't it Voltaire? They go to him on his deathbed, and a member of the clergy comes to him on his deathbed and says, "Look, it's coming. You know, it's not good. You need to renounce Satan." He's like, "Look, I'm not looking to make any enemies at this late stage."
Right.
that's why you eat the grapes, because you're just like, shit. What
I,
if
yes,
there's nothing to it? It's like Pascal's wager, right? If there's nothing to it, then I just had grapes.
right.
But let me
Right.
have them
Yeah.
just in case. And the irreality of the dreamlike quality of the place um, has an effect.
Yeah, and I read some statement, and maybe it was in regards to Mexico rather than Colombia, but it was about like trying to discuss Catholicism in Mexico is like trying to discuss like oxygen on planet Earth. And it's sort of like it's just everywhere. I don't know. You need it to live, and it's just like we don't talk about it. Oxygen every day. I don't think about oxygen, but it's just there, and it's sort of like
You also, like, if you grew up like I did, going to Catholic schools and all that, you're Catholic for the rest of your life. Whether
Right.
it doesn't
there's
matter
no
what
getting out.
no, but it doesn't matter what you believe, because it's not, you are Catholic. It's like me trying to deny that I'm Colombian in some way, even though I was born here. Um, yeah, it's like its own, I guess, ethnic group.
Yeah,
You don't have to believe any particular thing, but that's either in you or it isn't. There's another writer who talks about this, but the reference is you don't need to say lapsed Catholic. It
right,
doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
You're talking about what you believe,
right.
and this is somehow more basic than that.
Right.
Actually, Bruce Springsteen has a thing about this. Of growing up in New Jersey, St. Rosa Lima's church is like we grew up Catholic. We're Catholic. Like there's
Yeah.
just you don't think of Bruce Springsteen as a Catholic person. He's like I'm Catholic. He's
Yeah.
like that's what it was. So
That's great. That's
yeah,
exactly what I'm driving at. So you believe this? You believe that? No, I could
just
not.
Catholic.
I literally could not believe a single thing you're saying. But it's undeniable that I'm Catholic, and I think that's what he's driving
Yeah.
at,
Yeah,
because
George Saunders says
it's
that
not a
too, right?
considered reason set of beliefs. Now, unlike Christianity, that's different. Christianity does signal certain kind of beliefs, and but so the two things are not the same.
yeah, and you're right. Scalia was famously Catholic.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. He went to Xavier here which is a Catholic
So
all boys high
Jesuit
school.
school. Oh yeah.
well, this has been really great. We really appreciate you reading from the book, and we are going to ask you to stick around for. We do a short bonus thing after we wrap up here with a little bit of our internal housekeeping. If you're down, stick around for a few more minutes.
Of course.
Sweet.
Dave, anything you want to mention about our Patreon?
If you want to get exclusive bonus content, which gives a little extra time with each guest, you can go to our Patreon page, which is Matt. Do you have the URL for us?
Patreon.com/concavity show. That's it.
There it is. Yeah, cool. We just posted Lauren Elkin's bonus episode yesterday, and about a week ago posted Don Huff's bonus episode, which unfortunately kind of got lost in the email, so I apologize for that. It's on me. But yeah, if you want to support the show, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our patrons. We couldn't do it without you. And Matt, where else can people find us
We're
online?
mostly on Instagram, Concavity. You can just look up Concavity Show, and you can always email us, concavityshow@gmail.com. We like getting
That's
your
right.
emails. And if you haven't left us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that does help other people find the show. So we're appreciative for those people who have done it. And we will be back with a new episode soon.
Yeah. And Sergio, if people want to find more of your stuff or information about you online, are there any good places that come to mind for you for that? I don't think you're on any social media platforms.
Do any of that stuff.
Maybe a website? Do we have a website?
I have a
SergioDelaPava.com?
I'm sure it's fallen into disuse.
Okay.
Yeah, go on there and I'll get your email. If you want to send me something and you want to just e-chat, you can do that.
Okay, awesome.
Pava.com, I guess.
Great. Sergio, thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight talking to you. Like I said, you're one of our favorite writers. We've talked about you for a decade, so it's feels like a real mountaintop to finally have you on the show. Thank you so much.
You guys are killing it, and thanks for letting me be a small part of it.
Right on. And thanks so much as well to your spouse, Susanna, for doing the publicity and sort of like all the correspondence with her setting this up. So huge thanks to her. That's awesome.
I will pass that along.
Right on.
Catch me now as I sing into darkness. I thought to be extinct.
But that my last page. So this is my last. I'll see if I can get this on camera. Last page. I
Yes.
said, what the fuck?
That's kind of similar to what my editor on that book wrote towards the end.
Oh yeah.
He
I
took
mean,
it
I
all,
loved it, but
the
I was
hell
just
just
like,
happened. He says
I was like,
something like
man,
that.
it's almost like that movie Tree of Life, where he's like,
Oh,
in order to tell this story, he's like, we need to go back to like the dinosaurs.
nice.
Yeah, yeah.
That
The
is a
comprehensive
that is a
overview
nice
of
that is a nice movie. That's a nice movie.